This is the Workplace Podcast with your host, William Corless. Brought to you in association with Yellowwood, your external learning and development partner. Each week we focus on a different aspect of the workplace. We hear from guest speakers who are subject matter experts and who are incredibly talented at what they do. These experts will give you a different perspective and insight to work life, with the aim of empowering you to take a different path to success in all aspects of work life. These perspectives will include career and personal success, leadership, high-performance teams, and creating a better work-life culture and organisation. Yellowwood, take a different path to success with your career, team, and organisation. Today's guest is Professor Karthik Ramana. He is a Professor of Business and Public Policy at the Blavatnik School of Government in the University of Oxford, as well as a Fellow at St John's College. He teaches on managing organisations in polarised times, which led to his 2024 book, The Age of Outrage. An expert on business-government relations, sustainable capitalism, and corporate reporting and auditing, Professor Ramana studies how organisations and leaders build trust with stakeholders. His scholarship has won numerous awards, including Journal of Accounting, an Economics Best Paper Prize, the Harvard Business Review McKinsey Award for Groundbreaking Management Thinking, and 3 times the International Case Centre's prizes for Outstanding Case Writing, dubbed by the Financial Times as the Business School Oscars. Previously, Professor Ramana taught at the Harvard Business School in both the MBA and Senior Executive Education programs, and he holds a doctorate from MIT's Sloan School of Management.
Welcome to the Workplace Podcast, Karthik.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me, William.
So what a timely book you have written. And as you can see, I've done my research for this with all the notes I've made. I just showed you previously. And what I love about this book, not only is it a fascinating read with all your case studies there, we'll go into that later on, it's overlaid with best practice managerial and leadership insights, along with economics, with systems thinking, along with psychology of aggression, and if I may boldly say so, mediation principles. I love that, especially making space for others, and we'll talk about that as we go through. So people would have heard your introduction, and they might be listening in here and might say, we're in an age of outrage, and someone like you can come across as the elite, the 1%. You are this system. How could you possibly understand my plight? Even listening to you, talk down to me, if you might, that's why they might be perceived. Like, what might you say to them? You don't understand my plight. Do you represent the system?
Well, I certainly can't claim that I don't. And in fact, this was one of the insights or the ahas that prompted me to write this book. My own personal background is I grew up in a fairly middle-class background in Bombay, India, and I moved to the United States as a student. So I'm an immigrant twice over, first to the United States and then to the United Kingdom. I've effectively been a scholarship student through much of my higher education. So when I found myself in this position where I was leading a program on public leadership for 1,000 public leaders from 120 countries around the world, I hardly saw myself as part of the system. I saw myself as someone who had come up through the ranks. But of course, that's not how others experienced me. And that was an important insight and an important realization for me, to recognize that over the course of my career, I had assumed a position of privilege, and I now had to act from the responsibility of that privilege, which often meant, giving space and making space for others. So my intent in writing this book was very much to bring together a lot of the reflections that I had over the course of my 8-year journey leading that community of government leaders from around the world. And saying, okay, what are some insights from that particular undertaking that might be more broadly applicable?
Yeah, and that's what I liked about this book. Even the introduction itself, just like you've talked us through there, gives you those highlights. And one thing that really stuck out for me in that is history is not destiny. Do you want to give us the concept of that to our listeners? What does that mean?
Yeah, so an important part of the first chapter of the book is understanding why we are in this age of outrage. Saying you can't really manage in the age of outrage, you can't lead through the age of outrage if you don't understand the drivers of outrage.
Mm.
And so that does require an understanding of history. It does require a perspective on, the economic forces that are really sort of adding to anxiety and uncertainty in everyday people's lives. And also it requires an understanding of people's profound sense of disillusionment with the economic system. Now, that understanding might sort of disillusion you. It might say that, oh gosh, we're looking at all of these forces. We are condemned to, at the very least, relive history, or worst, live out some even more abysmal manifestation of it. Of course, the point of learning history is to recognize that there are ways through active leadership, there are ways through engaged leadership that you can set forth a different path. And that's what I meant by that particular phrase, that we have to recognize why it is we're here dealing with this age of outrage. We have to understand what are the forces that are provoking deep distrust across organizations, within organizations, and between people and the governments that are supposed to serve them. But then we have to act on that understanding and try play out a different version of history, try play out a new movie, if you must, rather than relive the movie that we saw perhaps in the 1930s or worse.
And this is where, when I teach leadership, I always teach leadership, you have to look at things through different lenses. And I love this systemic thinking that it's history, it's economics, it's understanding all of your stakeholders. So we just recorded a podcast with Professor Paul Argenti on crisis communications. And this is where you're trying to understand what are the sources here, what are the drivers, and what is it that I'm responsible for and the organization is responsible for, and what is it that we can take responsibility for. So isn't that the case, is that it's understanding many different layers and lenses to this leadership mindset?
That's absolutely right. I mean, leadership is about good judgment, and good
Mm,
judgment is, as Isaiah Berlin says in his excellent article on political judgment, it's more art than science. It's not
yeah,
something that you can say, we've run some regressions or I've run the math and here
yeah.
here's the answer. Good judgment is about having really, in Berlin's words, a well-developed discrimination of what matters from the rest. And that means, of course, having lenses to be able to understand the sort of the complete chaos that might be in front of you, and say, okay, therefore, given that understanding, what really matters in this situation? Now, if you tend to look at a situation in front of you through the lenses of, say, one discipline, perhaps you are an economist and you tend to view everything through the lenses of economics, or likewise, you're a lawyer and you look at things through the lenses of law, or a psychologist, and so on, the chances are that you will miss important things and you will not have that well developed discrimination of what matters from the rest. So these disciplines are important insofar as they give you an insight or a collective insight into the problem. And that's why it is truly multidisciplinary or pan-disciplinary. But then at some point, even the insights from the disciplines will not be enough. Even the sum of the insights from the disciplines will not be enough. And that's where this notion of judgment comes in, because it is the whole that is greater than the sum of its individual parts. And that's what, an exercise in leadership development is really training people to do, build that good judgment.
So speaking of leadership, then, what is the leadership mindset then that people should aspire to?
So, in this age of outrage, I think it requires a different conception of leadership. One of the first premises of the book is managing in the age of outrage is not managing outrage. Managing outrage is crisis management.
Yeah.
And we're quite good at that. It's not easy, but we know how to do that. But managing in the age of outrage means you can't approach this by sort of outsourcing the decision making, say, to a PR team or a comms team or a crisis management team. It means that you have to incorporate your response very much into your strategy, into everything you do on a daily basis. Because if you were in firefighting mode 24/7, then when would you have the time to do fire prevention and fire planning? let alone when would you have the time to do all the things that really matter, like investing in human capital and human flourishing. So you have to build your response into the way you do strategy, into the way you manage on a day-to-day basis. And so managing in the age of outrage, it's sort of like, think of it as a new managerial skill, just like, you wouldn't put someone in a leadership position if they didn't know how to read a balance sheet, or if they didn't know the essentials of marketing and sales and finance and operations. You say you don't want people to be in leadership roles today if they haven't built this skill set of managing in the age of outrage.
So you have a leadership framework then that helps us go through this, and this is how the book is shaped as well. So can you talk us through the four-step model that you have now? It sounds like an easy 4 steps. I must tell our listeners it's a fascinating read. There's depth to this. So just that overall framework then, what is that? And then we'll go into a little bit more detail.
Sure. So at the core of the framework, and before we even get to step one, maybe you think of it as step zero, is this notion of turning down the temperature. This says that, look, if you're managing in the age of outrage, if you're dealing with outrage, you can't be in a emotive state of aggression, because if you are, or if the people around you are, then you're going to accomplish nothing, and there's no point walking through the other 4 steps. So at the core is that point of turning down the temperature. And I wrote that first chapter in Turning Down the Temperature very much from the perspective of the manager themselves, because there's this tendency of managers to see themselves as somehow rational beings above the fray, to your point about being the elite. And very much, everybody else around you is sort of prone to outrage, but you as the manager are not. But of course, we're all human and we're all prone to outrage. And the forces that are sort of applying on society that provoke us to this state of aggression apply to us as managers ourselves. So how do you understand, in some sense, where does aggression come from in the brain, with the view to say, okay, therefore, how do I enter as a manager or leader into a situation with the expectation that I can make it better, I can leave it better than I found it, that I at least won't make it worse because of my own emotive state of aggression. So that's the core of it, the turning down the temperature bit. And then, as you say, there are 4 further steps to the framework, which you sort of iterate through as you're trying to deal with the problem. Very quickly, the first of these is to really scope and bound the problem, to understand how or what is really at cause in the proximate sense of the problem or the crisis that you're dealing with. And you want to put some structure on it, and you want to say, okay, what's going on in this moment. Once you've done that, you have to decide, okay, now that I understand what's going on, what part of it will I own? Because we're living in this age of outrage, you can very quickly overcommit yourself to, to all of the problems that are being put on your plate or your organization's plate. And then very quickly you bankrupt your organization. So you have to have a deliberate sense of when to lean in and when to lean out. And that's sort of that next step of the framework. Once you've done that, the third step is to say, okay, well, now how do I get this strategy done? Because, of course, if you're operating in an age of outrage, and even if you've made the right choices on when to lean in and when to lean out, you can't just order people to implement your strategy because they're outraged. So you have to figure out how to deftly and cleverly deploy power in this context so that you're able to drive the organization to the ends that it needs to accomplish. And then the final step recognizes what you said in the beginning, which is all this is really hard. It's hard for yourself as a person, and it's hard for your organization. So how do you do all these other things that we talked about while keeping your resilience, while renewing your resilience? And that takes you very quickly through the framework in the book.
So let me start with that step zero, as you said, and I love this concept that you introduced the reader to, is the general aggression model. Can you explain to us what that is?
Yeah, that's a model developed by 2 outstanding scientists, Bushman and Anderson, who basically bring together a lot of literature in behavioral science and psychology and experimental work to say, okay, is there a general model of aggression in the brain? I sort of adapt that model in a managerial context and say, it's important to understand where aggression comes from in the brain, but obviously not just from the perspective of being sort of, an informed neuroscientist, but then from the perspective saying, as a manager, what can you do about it? And it turns out there are three things that matter in thinking about aggression or the sources of aggression. The first, of course, is the ambient state, which means you're more likely to be prone to aggression in a crowded room where the temperature is hot, say the air conditioning is broken or something like that, than you are in a cool, comfortable, spacious lounge where everybody is sipping on green tea or chamomile tea or something like that. So ambient conditions matter tremendously. And if you as a manager or leader find yourself in averse ambient conditions, don't try, sort of dive in more deeply, because chances are you will sort of be prone to aggression and you leave the situation worse. You think about how, leaders often face the press with cameras and, hot light bulbs shining on them. It's the worst conditions to keep your cool under. So absolutely don't want to use that as a context in which you're trying to turn down the temperature. Beyond that ambient state, other things that matter are your emotive response. So this is your immediate triggering response in a situation. Maybe that, when you've been, so the example I give in the book is you've been rear-ended in your car. And maybe in the context of being rear-ended, it brings to mind some tragic episode in your life or some traumatic episode in your life. Then even if it was an honest mistake from the person who rear-ended you, you would be immediately triggered into a state of aggression because of that emotional trigger. So that emotive response matters. And the age-old wisdom about sleep on important decisions therefore really makes sense, right? If you're triggered to an emotive response, just disengage, because that's the best thing you can do in that scenario. Sleep on it, come back to it when you're in a better mind state. Of course, the final thing that matters beyond the ambient conditions and the emotive response is your so-called deliberate or cognitive response. And of course, we like to think of our deliberate or cognitive response as somehow being flawless or rational or in any event, quite reasonable. What we think of as rational or reasonable is, of course, a product of our lived experiences. So when we do a rational analysis of a situation in our mind, that base is based on all of the lived experiences and all of what the literature calls knowledge structures that you've built over the course of your life. And someone with a very different set of experiences will apply different rules of reasoning. They will apply different assumptions to a reasoning model. And so they might perfectly rationally come out to a different conclusion. So understanding how these differences in knowledge structures affect your response, especially, for instance, if you're a leader of a large, complex organization, say with very diverse employees or very diverse customers, very diverse investors, and you have sort of, been surrounded by a certain set of conditions, then how you look at the situation will be very different from how your customers or your employees or your investors look at the situation. So having those points of engagement around your stakeholder group are really important to ensuring you get really a broad perspective on what is in fact reasonable in this scenario.
And it was funny as you were talking there, I recalled a part of the book. I think it's in a general area about toxic masculinity. And I'm just thinking where this is quite prevalent now, especially in social media, where toxic masculinity, there's pylons and all these different things going on. So we'll say, for example, so there is an element of toxic masculinity. How do we understand that? And if we see it in the workplace, like what further insights could you offer?
Yeah, this applies to all forms of reasoning. Let's take that particular example. And let's say that you have, through the course of your lived experiences, perhaps, for no fault of your own, you grew up in a household where the father figure or the male figure in your household was especially dominant and was especially disrespectful to the women in your life. Then that becomes the set of premises or the set of axioms under which you reason. You reason that that is, in fact, the way things are. And so when you run through an analysis of a situation, you are in that context, for no fault of your own, because these were the set of experiences you were exposed to as a child, conditioned to behave in a way that we might refer to as toxic, right? The same can be true about if you grew up, say, in a household where, say, the dominant figures were racist, or you grew up in a household where the dominant figures were homophobic, or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
Likewise, you might grow up in a household where you don't have any male figures, right? And so you are then cheated of the ability to have those role models, positive role models in your life. And so the way you approach a situation might again be quite skewed. This is not to
Yeah.
say that the problem is only on the context of toxic masculinity. There can be sort of a reverse or an opposite problem as well, right? So the point of this kind of knowledge structure is to recognize that what we see as rational, what we see as logical, isn't necessarily objectively rational or logical because it's a product of our lived experiences. And if you are trying to manage for others, right? I mean, leadership is,
Yeah.
of course, serving others. If you're trying to do that, then you have to understand what they're bringing to the table. What are the assumptions that are driving the way they view a situation, rather than say, oh, these people are stupid, they vote against their interests or something like that.
Yeah.
You have to say, wait a minute, what is it about the situation that I don't understand, that I must understand if I'm going to be a leader or a manager in this context?
And I love the fact that you bring this into the book, of that principle of othering. It's like the blame game people, and we just see them as others and us. And this is why we're in a polarized world, isn't it? That's essentially the nub of it, isn't it? Is that
Yeah.
we don't understand people's perspectives, and then kind of going idiots, or what did you do that? We might take a stance then because of that.
That's right. What's happened, perhaps as a result of the great deal of anxiety that people feel about the world today, whether it's due to things like artificial intelligence or other technologies that are completely changing the way the economy and the nature of work will be rewarded, or whether it's things like climate change, or whether things like demographic shifts and aging populations and so forth. You have lots of forces driving uncertainty and anxiety in the world. And perhaps as a result of people feeling that the system is somehow rigged, it's
Yeah.
somehow broken, and it doesn't work for them, right? That I work hard, but somehow the elite are the ones that always get rewarded. Or I was sold this story about how globalization and immigration would make my life better, but all I see is that my wages have decreased, at least in a relative sense, and my purchasing power has decreased, and prices are now really high, and I'm struggling, and I work 4 jobs, and this and that. As a result of that, there has been a tendency to revert to our tribal instincts, to see the world in these us versus them lenses, rather than say through this global humanist enlightenment project that sort of effectively we were driving towards, with of course notable periods of exception, we've been driving towards since the French Revolution and the American War of Independence, which is this what we would call the Enlightenment. And we're seeing actually a distinct rise of anti-enlightenment sort of forces in the world, not necessarily unreasonably so. Again, if
Yeah.
you look at the lived experiences or the knowledge structures of a majority of people around the world, they might say, wait a minute, this enlightenment thing hasn't worked out so well for us. And so that's what's giving rise to this othering and this notion of us versus them. And it's important to understand that, again, from a managerial or a leadership
Yeah.
perspective, because if you don't understand and you don't appreciate that, you tend to write off people as being sort of somehow silly
Yeah.
or uninformed or
Yeah.
uneducated. But that might not be it at all.
When I teach mediation or conflict resolution techniques, I often frame it as what's contributing to this person's behavior, what's contributing to the situation. And once you understand that it's able to, you're able to have that empathy and to create that movement and create that enlightenment, as you were saying. And then it's mutual enlightenment, isn't it? It's enlightenment for them. It's a two-way street. And that moves me on to then the aspect of leadership power. Now, this is probably not widely taught, but I looked at this book, and in chapter five should be taught in every MBA program because I think it's so fascinating. So you talk about sources of power and how I can influence, because this is essentially, with great power comes great responsibility. And also what we have then is that ability to influence. And sometimes we don't recognize our power, and sometimes it might be subconscious. You talked about conditioning is how there might be an abuse of power, and that could be linked to toxic masculinity or whatever. So is it okay if we have a conversation about power right now and maybe sources of power. People don't know about power. It might be a good place to start.
Yes, sure. So, the first thing I've noticed about power is people are uncomfortable talking about it, right? Because, and that might be a good thing, because if you love talking about power, maybe you're a sociopath. But the fact is that you can't get anything done without power, right? And so, power, sociologists define power as the potential to mobilize the energy of others to your ends. Now, if you're a leader in an organization, whether you have, some sort of positional authority or whether you're sort of a ground, bottom-up leader, you need power to get things done. So power is absolutely essential to getting anything done. First things first, have a healthy relationship with power. It's good that you might be hesitant to talk about power, but it doesn't mean you therefore ignore an analysis of power. Secondly, there are sources of power and there are ways to deploy power that are pro-social, and there are sources and ways to deploy power that might be depletive or antisocial. And so that's where this tension comes from, right? And so if you think about power in the book, I introduce four ways in which to look at power. There's emotive power, which is the kind of power that, say, a mother has over a child, or a religious leader might have over a congregation. There is rational power, which is the sort of power that, say, two scientists might use with each other to make argumentation, through the use of sort of rigorous rules of logic and sort of well accepted and empirically grounded assumptions. And then there's coercive power, which is the kind of power that comes from your position. This would be the power that, say, for example, the colonel of a regiment would have over the troops under her or his command. And then finally, there is a relational power, which is, it can be, or what in the book I call reciprocal power, is a way in which you do things sometimes with the sort of proximate expectation of return, but sometimes without maybe approximate expectation of return, with the long-term expectation that this is a symbiotic relationship. And each of these types or these taxonomies of power have their advantages and they have their disadvantages, right? I mean, there are certain situations where coercive power, notwithstanding its slightly pejorative connotation, is absolutely essential. There are contexts in which emotive power is the only way you can get things done. There are contexts in which rational power is actually, you don't want there to be a change in the definition of, say, what a kilogram is based on emotions. You want that to be based on a rational discussion. The element of power that I think is especially valuable in this age of outrage is this reciprocal power, particularly reciprocal power of a relational kind, which is to say that if you want people to move towards a particular course of action, if you want to mobilize the energy of others to your end, you want them to do it on their own terms rather than because they're being forced or because they feel they're somehow being emotionally coerced or because they feel they're being lectured to, right? Even if it's good reason. You want them to come on their own terms. And this is especially important in this age of outrage. So part of that chapter on power is understanding in particular the dynamics of this reciprocal power of the relational kind and saying, okay, how do we therefore build this in an organization? How do we build this with our key stakeholders? And what we find from really successful managers that are profiled in the case studies in the book is that they've taken the time to actually put power in the hands of the people that they need to manage and build the culture, build the context where those people themselves, of their own free will, make the decisions that this particular manager might think are right for the organization. Now, that's very hard to do. It takes a good bit of effort and time and so forth, but that's what is lasting leadership in the age of outrage.
So if I was to do that in a practical sense, would that be that I would do a lot of consensus building within the organization? What are the challenges, what we need to address, and then create those relational contracts or co-created agreements? This is how we're going to operate. And then what happens if something doesn't happen, where you can build in accountability, responsibilities, just creating clarity around expectations. Is that from a practical sense what you mean for managers?
Yeah. So, I mean, at the core, it involves three things. First, it involves delegating the decision to the people who feel most aggrieved in a scenario. right? So that when a decision needs to be made, they are the ones making the decision rather than they feel like they're on the receiving end of the decision. And very often, whether it's in the political context or the business context, managers tend to say, well, I figured it out and this is the right decision, so let me make it for everybody, right? And whether this is in the realm of, say, something like climate change, where the so-called experts have figured out what needs to be done, as if it only weren't for the stupid people around the world that wouldn't sort of just comply with all these expert decisions, we'd have solved this problem a long time ago. But that's not how the world works. And likewise, if you're a CEO of a company, right, that's not really the way you build sort of a stable workforce and a culture of trust. So the first and most important thing is to delegate that decision to the people who feel most affected by it. The second element is to equip those people with the good judgment to make those decisions wisely, right? Simply delegating decisions to people and saying, okay, well, you make your mistakes and you figure it out, you're on your own. That's also irresponsible. So you say if you're going to delegate it, you want to equip people with the ability to exercise good judgment in a scenario, in a particular context. And oftentimes organizations that do delegate forget to train people how to exercise that delegation. That's really important to get right. And then the third thing is to recognize that if you do delegate decisions to people, and even if you do train them to make the decisions, they will make mistakes. And you need to have a culture in which those mistakes serve as the basis for further learning rather than to serve as the basis for retribution. Because if the mistakes serve as the basis for retribution, then of course no one will ever make a decision again. Nobody will exercise the delegated authority, regardless of how well you've trained them. So it's all three of these things that matter. A, you need to delegate. B, you need to train people to exercise that delegation wisely. And C, you need to forgive people when they make mistakes, if they're non-malicious mistakes. And people, importantly, need to trust you that you will forgive them if that were the situation, right? And so it requires all three things in order for you to be able to use or to deploy this relational power that we were talking about earlier.
And for our listeners, just on that last point about making mistakes in your organization, we have recorded a podcast with Professor Amy Edmondson on how learning to fail can teach us how to thrive and how to handle mistakes in the workplace and create that psychological safety. And as I was listening to you there, then I really was struck by the notion where you said leaders have a responsibility to train people to practice that good judgment. And then I recall a part of your book where you talk about the need to develop organizational leadership capacity. And I think that's sometimes missing, is that we just expect people to go, here are the tools, off we go, or we'll fire money at it, or when we don't give them a resource of time or maybe the training to do so. Can we just talk about like developing organizational capacity? What does that look like in reality?
Yeah. So it's this education for judgment that we talk about, and in the book I cite an example, a study of Toyota as a car company. The original study was conducted by someone else. There's this example that's given in that original study where a very seasoned manager from another car company is brought in to Toyota to serve as a manager on the Toyota assembly line. And Toyota is well known for its for delegating authority, not just to managers on the assembly line, to rank and file operators on the assembly line. So delegation is in their DNA in that sense. So this manager sort of looks at the Toyota assembly line that he's in charge of and says, well, we should move this parts rack closer to where the engineer is on the assembly line, because then we'll be able to save some time. And his trainer says, wait a minute, what do you mean we have to move the parts rack closer? How much closer? Is it 3 centimeters closer? Is it 5 centimeters closer? Why have you not specified that? And how much time do you expect to save? Is it 4 seconds per car? Is it 8 seconds per car? And if we save less time or more time, what would we learn from that? Right? So there is in that series of questions, there is a habit of excellence that this particular trainer is trying to inculcate in this manager, and is saying, look, you can't just sort of wing it and say that's what we're going to do. You need to be very well prepared to exercise that delegation. And if you are well prepared to exercise that delegation, then we will celebrate that delegation. And regardless of the outcome, we will have your back. Whether it turns out to improve things or worsen things, we will still have your back. But you need to be really well prepared before the fact. And that driving home that spirit of excellence is really important. And there are other organizations that do a really good job in this context that are profiled in the book similarly. So the point there is if you're going to delegate particular decision to, in this case, the manager, then it's really important for the manager to be equipped to make that or to exercise that delegation wisely. So what the trainer is trying to do there is to say, unless you have seized on that moment of excellence, unless you have recognized what it takes to exercise that delegation appropriately, it's not worth exercising that delegation. And if, in fact, we trust you to have exercised that delegation wisely and with a habit of excellence, then, of course, we will have your back. Regardless of what happens, we will support you. So even if the experiment in moving the parts rack closer doesn't turn out to yield the benefits, we're not going to punish you for it. But we need to know before you've exercised that decision that you've thought about it well and that you've embraced the spirit of excellence in which we would expect you to exercise your delegated authority.
Speaking about developing leadership capacity, then, so sometimes people are confused how to be a leader in outrage or crisis. Should I be stoic? Should I be optimistic? Should I show vulnerability? Should it be all of the above elements? It's confusing for people, isn't it?
It is, of course. And I mean, the first and most important thing is first be yourself, right? And to say, okay, you don't want to force yourself into a scenario where you feel like you're responding unnaturally in this context. It's also important, as you're being yourself, to be self aware, where for situations where that's unhelpful, and say, okay, therefore, how do I aspire to be a better version of myself? How do I change who I am so that I can be more effective in this scenario? So it's both of those things. It's that tension that you're always navigating in a personal development capacity. Now, as you think about what's needed in this age of outrage, in leadership in this age of outrage, one of the messages in the book is, no matter what you do, you're not going to be able to solve the whole problem in front of you. And another key message of the book is, no matter what you do, you're going to be experienced as part of the problem, part of the age of outrage, or the cause of the age of outrage. So having a sense of what are the problems you can control and what are the problems you cannot control is really important. And this is why, when I asked a number of the leaders that we profiled in the book who have successfully navigated their organizations through this context, what was their favorite philosophy, they many of them sort of pointed to Stoicism. Now, Stoicism is interesting in that it tends to have a bad rap. I mean, people think of Stoicism as sort of almost somehow disengaged from emotions, emotionally unintelligent. But that's not what Stoicism is at all. Stoicism is the capacity to control your emotions so that you say, well, there are things that are going to happen to me, and there are things that are going to happen in my life that are well beyond my control. And so for me to get worked up about those things is not a very good use of my mental faculties and energy and so forth. But there are things that are going to happen to me that are under my control. And so that's what I need to focus on. So Stoicism helps you separate the things that are under your control and the things that are not under your control. And it focuses your energies to improve on the things that are under your control. The other thing Stoicism really encourages you to do is to be careful about what you say, what in the literature is called a dialectical sophistication, right? And that's useful because what you say or what you don't say in the age of outrage will be used against you. So having that dialectical sophistication is also a useful tool in not being misunderstood in the context of everything that's happening.
And just on those points about being vulnerable, during the pandemic, people would say I should show vulnerability or not. And this big argument emerged. People are looking for strength, and other people want to say, well, I'm a real person too, what are your thoughts on that? Is it case by case, or should we always say, listen, I'm just a human being, so it demonstrates I can be people have empathy with me, or does it show weakness in a time where we should be more stoic?
There are moments for vulnerability, and there are moments where it might be inappropriate. One of the other pieces of reading that really resonated with leaders that are profiled in the book is Admiral Stockdale, Jim Stockdale's sort of reflection on what he calls or actually what Jim Collins calls the Stockdale paradox. And what it is, people say, oh, should I be this sort of inspirational, bombastic leader that sort of rallies the troops in the context of crisis, or should I just be the cold, hard realist? And the answer is both, right? Because, and not that you have to be bombastic in the sense of, unrealistic, because people will immediately see that, and Admiral Stockdale says that about his experience in being in a prisoner of war camp in Vietnam. He says there were people who would keep saying every day, other prisoners, we're going to be rescued tomorrow. We're going to be rescued tomorrow. A, nobody believed them. And B, they very quickly ran out of steam, right? So there were people, if on the other hand, who never lost faith in the ultimate belief that they would be rescued, that this was not, all for naught. But at the same time, we're cold hard realists that that might not be tomorrow. It might not be in 3 days. It might not be in 3 years. And so they planned accordingly. They planned for that long term. Those were the people that really emerged. It's a recognition that both of those things are important. If you run around like a headless chicken and say the sky's going to fall, no one will follow you. So people need to believe that you have the capacity and the emotional resilience to be able to navigate us through a crisis. But at the same time, if you are unrealistic about the fact that we are living in this crisis of uncertain length, and we are living in this crisis with deep divisions and polarization, and you say, oh, everything is fine, and we're just going to wave this magic wand and make things great again, then that's going to be a problem too. So it's both of those things that are really important for leadership. And that actually squares very nicely with the Stoic worldview. It says, accept the things that you can't control and work on the things that you can control.
So this is where I'd like to finish up the podcast. And this is a high for me. This is the concept of temperate leadership, especially when you're navigating a crisis. And this is what we said at the start of the episode of this podcast, was about making space for others. And what's the case for temperate leadership then? Like, why should it be part of our leadership mindset?
The classical Greeks talked about 4 virtue ethics. And they said, if you were thinking about what was desirable in a person, they said there were 4 virtuous qualities: courage, justice, wisdom, and temperance. And, courage, justice, and wisdom have gotten a fair bit of play. Courage, in particular, gets a lot of play. A lot of our Hollywood movies are about this. A lot of our stories about leadership are about sort of, courageous leaders, just leaders. Wisdom also gets a good play. The part of those 4 virtues that perhaps gets least play is temperance. In fact, temperance is sometimes seen as sort of a negative quality rather than a positive. It's seen and misunderstood as someone who is sort of opportunistic, who is prone to compromise, who doesn't really stand for anything, right? But in fact, it's quite the opposite. In fact, if you look at some of the most temperate leaders in modern times, 2 come to mind. One is Nelson Mandela, and the other is Yitzhak Rabin. No one can accuse either of them for not being clear about what they stood for. I mean, both of them spent their whole lives fighting for the things they stood for. But at the same time, when there were pivotal moments to shape their country's futures, to shape the futures for their societies, they resisted the urge to say they know best. They resisted the urge to sort of lead from ahead. And in fact, what they wanted to do was to create the conditions where people in their societies could make those decisions for themselves, right? Going back to that notion of reciprocal leadership that we were talking about, or reciprocal power that we were talking about earlier. That's what made them temperate leaders, right? That they said, I am secure enough in my confidence, and I'm secure enough in my values and what I stand for to say that that's not what this moment is about. But I'm going to actually transfer all of that goodwill to create legitimacy for a process that allows for this divided polity. In the case of Mandela, it was post-apartheid South Africa. Mandela was arguably the most powerful president South Africa had seen in its history in that moment after he assumes the presidency at the end of apartheid. And he could have gotten whatever he wanted done. He could have shaped society whichever way he wanted because of the power of his personality and his goodwill. But what he does is he transfers all of that to a process and says, I'm going to invest that goodwill in a lasting legacy of democratic decision making. And I want, South Africans to, over time, muddle through and figure out what's right for them, rather than me tell you what's right for them. Mugabe across the border in Zimbabwe did the opposite. He used that tremendous power he had when he was at that pivotal moment to say, I figured it all out. Here's the way we're going to do it, etc. We're going to, basically create this new society. And, whether he was right or wrong, turned out he was largely wrong. The point is that it was not a deliberative process. It was not a process that reflected the polarization in the society at that point. The problem with those kinds of despotic leaders is they will make mistakes in the long run.
This is my time to make space for you and your book, and for you to promote what you do and how people can find more about your book. And before we leave, I cannot leave this podcast without mentioning the book is full of some great studies and examples of leadership lessons from the London Met, the Brazil Education Minister, Tylenol and Johnson & Johnson, the Vatican Bank, Oxford University Hospital, IKEA, and all the challenges that they faced. And this is where we're going to give you the opportunity now to let our listeners know how might people find more about your book, The Age of Outrage, How to Lead in a Polarized World, and how might they contact you?
Sure. So the easiest way to do that without learning how to spell my name is to Google The Age of Outrage and Oxford. So Age of Outrage, Oxford. And one of the first things that will come up will be my website, karthikramana.com. Click on that, and that has all the resources, including where you might obtain the book, some reviews of the book, how you might contact me if you want me to come and speak at your organization, how you might reach out for me to do that. So all of those resources are on that website, but all you need to do is Google Age of Outrage and Oxford, and that should be what shows up.
Professor Karthik Ramana, Professor of Business and Public Policy for the University of Oxford's Blavatnik School of Government. Thank you for joining the Workplace Podcast.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me, William.
Excellent.
Thanks for listening to the Workplace Podcast with your host, William Corless. Our special thanks to this episode's guest for sharing their expertise with us. If you found this episode valuable, please rate and review it. For updates on future episodes and to get in contact with us about any workplace topics, please follow Yellowwood on LinkedIn and Twitter at Different Paths. As always, you can head over to yellowwood.ie for any other information. Yellowwood, your external learning and development partner, provider of executive coaching, facilitation, and training. Take a different path to success with your career, leadership, team, and organization.